I said, you're definitely a media bigwig. You spent 30 years in the trenches of media in journalism, including time as a publisher at the Calgary Herald. And you were also a decade at the CRTC, the Canadian Radio Telecommunications Commission. I also do have sometimes listeners from the US. So I do want to say this for anybody that's listening, manufacturing the US. Today, we are going to be addressing issues around free speech, around censorship, around the power of information. So while we are talking from a Canadian perspective to an extent, there is a worldwide issue that's happening around content and information. So just want to set that scene for everybody. So Peter, any other introduction that I've missed about you that you want to add before we continue on?
No, that was very flattering. Thank you. Could have been far worse.
Well, I wanted to definitely address that, because we were talking a bit before the show about, political perspectives, where people came from, how we're judged or labeled. And I will say this, I was probably historically someone, that would have been seen as the left. But now people may see me as the right. In fact, but my views haven't changed. I'm very curious. I want to ask questions, and definitely as a journalist, I mean, censorship was seen as such a dirty word in the world of journalists. So, what are your thoughts on where we are right now in terms of legislation? Can you sort of give a bit of an overview for people that are tuning in and saying, well, why do we even need to talk about journalism in 2023 and beyond?
Well, we need to talk about journalism because it's one of the areas that's been most impacted by this technological revolution that we're going through. And it's the changes that have taken place with the invention really of the World Wide Web, the internet, really changed the business model for primarily newspapers, but also for other news organizations. Television's been impacted, radio's been impacted, but none so badly or severely as print newspapers. So we have this, and this is happening throughout North America, this sort of crisis in news, as it's called, which it is a crisis, but it's something we will get through. I think it's probably, we can get into it later, but it's probably a matter of finding a new horse for journalism to ride. In Canada, right now, we've got a series of legislation. There's the Online Streaming Act, which gave the CRTC, which is the Canadian equivalent of the FCC, control over the internet. It assumed that it defined the internet as broadcasting, which is a really breathtaking thing to do, as far as I'm concerned, and puts it under the control. I mean, you just think about this, something called the Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission, right? I mean, if you're trying to, and that's one of the biggest disappointing things about it, is that here we are in the cusp of this technology revolution, which makes it causes all kinds of problems, that's for sure, but it has all kinds of possibilities, right? And our main approach, rather than creating an entirely new, communications act that will embrace the internet and its possibilities, you'd have to control some things too. There's all kinds of issues you need to watch out for, has been to go backwards with that. And then there's the Online News Act, which is an attempt to, I guess, nicest way of putting it is to recover advertising revenue that news organizations have lost to online web giants, as they're called, such as Meta and Google, who aren't really in the news business, but they created a more efficient way for people to advertise and reach people. So that's where, and there's one more thing to come. Mm-hmm. The online harms legislation, which the government has been kicking around for a couple of years. It's been quite frustrated because every time it rolls out what it wants to do, people remind it that it likely violates the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the guarantee of free expression held therein. So they seem to be kind of frustrated by that, but there's definitely this government is very keen to control the internet in one way or the other.
And this is what seems and I know there's people here from manufacturing and anybody that's in marketing and public relations like I am. One of the things that's been a bit of an uphill battle too is getting people to understand that, and I know you've spoke about this, that the internet, the web, social media can be about opportunity. And I've often said, like, resisting this trend, because it's no longer a trend. It's like we're surrounded by it every day. And yet there's still people wanting to say, nope, don't want to use it. And we have a government now that seems to be, and I'd say on both sides of the border, wants to keep trying to, and you use the term harness. Can you talk a bit about that? Because I think some people in manufacturing need to understand where we're at, the reality. I mean, you're not someone just, you're not the new kid on the block either. You've come from the print. That's why I really wanted to have you on here, because you've been a print guy.
Yeah. I mean, well, print was kind of over about 15 years ago, right? I mean, anybody who was on the outside of the only people who still believed that print might have a future were the people in print, right? Because I mean, the first wave that happened was, you have to understand the construction of the print industry in Canada is like, at least 70% of the revenue was from advertising, right? And about half of that was from classified advertising, right? This is not the sort of the sort of display advertising that was the other was the name for the other portion. But so long before Facebook was even selling advertising, Craigslist and Kijiji was basically destroying the newspaper business model, right? Like, you used to be able to charge, if you were in Toronto and you were, advertising an apartment for rent 20 years ago, it would cost you $80 for an ad, a classified ad like that. The amount of money newspapers made from classified advertising was outrageous. Like, it was just huge, right? Like 12 columns on a page, 25 cents a word, or the Globe and Mail, probably 50 cents a word, that sort of stuff. And you'd be into it for, $200 or $300. Now, for consumers, Craigslist and Kijiji arriving, like, this saved them billions of dollars, right? Because you could only go through newspapers. If you were doing commerce. I was talking to somebody earlier today that, 25 years ago, if you had something to sell, if you were advertising something, you bought an ad in your local daily newspaper, and you bought one on the whatever local television station had the highest ratings. That's all you needed to do. You'd have 90% of the audience if you did that, which is a bigger share of the audience than Google and Facebook have right now. But, so there was one sort of duopoly in place, an unofficial one, and it's been replaced by another, right? So that's where people have got lost along the way. And news print, I mean, some people still like to hang on to it, but it has largely only stayed in print, I think, to maintain the revenue from the flyer delivery business. And that's pretty much dried up now too.
Yeah, it's definitely, and I've come out of that world as well, worked in print, but I have stories too about, like, before I left there, it was like difficult to even submit your stories by email. They wanted you to still phone it in. And I remember when the talk was like rolling of the eyes about, the internet and the World Wide Web, and it wasn't going to last. And it was, I mean, there's video clips out there of people being interviewed saying this was a fad, it wasn't going to last. And the other interesting thing is that with Craigslist, someone was just telling me this. I haven't fact checked this, but that the Craigslist, I think it was the Herald in San Francisco, it was offered to them to buy it, and they said no. I don't know.
That could be.
Okay. I didn't get a chance to double check that. Someone just told me that, but I'm thinking that probably sounds like it might have happened, that they would have.
Yeah, well, I mean, change of this scale is impossible for people to realize, and I remember the conversations too, that print would survive this because, you know what, when radio came along, everybody thought that would be the end of print, and it wasn't. And then television came along, and everybody thought, well, that'll be the end of print or radio, one of them. You know, it wasn't, but it didn't happen, right? So the internet was assumed to be the next thing, except the internet made things possible that those other things didn't, right? Like giving away instead of, you know, getting tens of millions of dollars in classified revenue, this guy over here was suddenly giving it away for free, right? Nobody in radio or television was giving advertising away for free. It became more competitive, but that wasn't happening. And, you know, and it's just human nature that, you know, sometimes you believe what you have to believe, right? And sometimes that's not in your best interest, right? And part of it too, when you have something this significant, and I really think a lot of people haven't been able to understand the size of the change we're going through. In my view, like the World Wide Web, it changes how we communicate in ways that we couldn't possibly have imagined. In the same way that the printing press, the invention of the printing press 600 years ago, did the same thing. And I'm sure there were people at the time saying, it's just a hunk of junk, and hardly anybody can read, doesn't really matter, right? Like, it's not gonna, how much difference can it make? But it changed everything. And not all of it was good, right? Yeah. All of a sudden, you know, Martin Luther's somebody's printing the Bible in German, people are reading it for itself, having their own interpretations. There's schisms in the church, which was the foundation of society at the time. And there were wars for 200 years, right? So, but, I mean, that's the downside, right? But it also spurred, you know, eventually the Enlightenment, right? And the Renaissance and all kinds of different ways of thinking. And guess what? Democracy and liberty, right? And all kinds of freedoms and concepts of freedoms that we couldn't have conceived of before, because people were suddenly able to decide for themselves what they thought about the world. Like I said, it's chaotic, but that's what I think that's what people miss about what's happening right now is the old things don't fit, which is why the Canadian government's actions, I refer to it as trying to stuff the 21st century into the 20th. It's not going to work.
And this is at the crux of what I also see happening often in manufacturing and in other worlds too, where there's this, you know, I was just talking to someone with this the other day, is that, you know, if salespeople aren't embracing and utilizing social, I mean, yes, it's important to do in person. Yes, it's important to go to trade shows, but if you aren't utilizing this other tool, you're really going to miss out. And it's also about getting stuck in doing things the same way we've always done them. And that is where we're at right now. When I look at what's happening with some of this legislation, is that there was sort of, it seems, a lack of curiosity, but also it became almost like an us and them. So I was wondering if you can talk about that, about what is happening where there's not an opportunity to listen to people that, you know, they may have a different political view, but why can't we listen to people that have more of that experience, like someone like yourself? What I found most fascinating about you, Peter, is that because of your background, because of what you came from print, you've had a long history there. So, and I bet you, if we had this discussion way back when, you know, we might have been a different conversation, but you are someone that has been able to adapt. And at least from my perspective, you seem to have opened up your mind to what the opportunities on the internet.
Well, I think that's what you got to do when something changes like that, right? It's kind of like, what can I do with this? It's, you know, once you recognize the significance of it, right? It can be kind of scary and kind of intimidating, right? And so I don't not empathize with some of the people whose business models are threatened. I mean, running a newspaper was a pretty cool thing to do, right? And newsrooms were, you know, magnificent. I remember visiting the Toronto Star newsroom once in, you know, 1990s or something, and I don't know, there's like 350 people in it, and it's this magnificent, huge scene. And if you've ever, the experience of going down to the presses when they're roaring away and even stopping and replating. And I mean, the Star's a good example. Its presses were running all the time. It had about 6 editions a day and that sort of stuff. It was very exciting, and they were very powerful entities, and they were gatekeepers too, right? I mean, the best opportunity as a citizen to have your voice heard in the public square was if you got a letter to the editor published. And that was pretty exciting, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there was somebody curating that, right? So to make sure it was within the bounds of good taste and that sort of stuff. And then the internet came along, and basically everybody has a printing press in their pocket right now, right? And they can say anything anywhere. I remember Heidi Fry, she's the head of the Heritage Committee right now in the House of Commons, and saying something years ago, we have to do something about the internet. People can say anything on there, right? And, yeah, I mean, the internet is not, people think of it as Wild West. It's not like the law doesn't apply to the internet. You can't slander people. You can't defame people. I mean, it takes a while for people to get caught up with these things. And there's a whole bunch of anything that, was illegal to do in print is illegal to do online, pretty much. And there's a whole bunch of things that are illegal. And then there's civil actions that people can take, as Fox News discovered, when you behave badly, right? There's penalties to pay. So, but the bigger thing is, like you said, like opening your minds to what is possible, right? In order to do that, you have to accept that what is current is no longer going to be possible, right? And that you have to change. For something like the newspaper business, that, let's face it, until computers were installed in newsrooms in the early 1980s, nothing had changed for 100 years, right? The printing press, I mean, printing presses got improved, but it was basically the same technology that people had, like 200 years practically since newspapers were invented. The same routine, the same patterns, the same curation of content, the same dominance in the marketplace, all those things, and then it's gone, just like that, right? In the blink of an eye. So what public policy makers should be doing is finding out how to transition from that old world to the new world, not about how can we preserve the old world, because you can't, right? You just have to accept the fact that, video stores were a lot of fun when my kids were little, right? You'd go down on Friday night, and it's sort of like, you get the pizza, I'll pick up a couple movies, one for the kids, one for us, right? And that's the way people live their lives, and then they're gone. Right. As soon as people could get 10 megabits per second streaming on internet service, because that for a long time everybody thought, internet will never be powerful enough to carry video, right? So it'd be okay, but that happened very quickly, and now it's just routine, right? So that all of a sudden the video stores are gone, right? They disappeared almost as fast as they arrived. But that's what people have to get used to, is that it's a cliche, that change is a constant. But if you're not prepared to change and question, right? You talk about your curiosity, question your own presumptions about the world, then you're going to get stuck in the old world and left behind.
I just recently, I was in the grocery store, and this is because I do work in mold making, but also in automation. And I know, automation is a wide field. And every time I go in the grocery store and I see the self-checkouts, and I'm like, no, I'm going to go and wait in line. Well, the other day I was in a hurry, and I was looking over. I went through the self-checkout, and I have to say, it was pretty easy and seamless. And I was actually able to pack the bag instead of rushing at the end. So I always said I may not be necessarily the earliest adapter, but I do realize that's part of change. And I said, I know it's coming. I was talking to a woman that works there, and she says there's 12 more of these coming in, right? They're doing these, renovating the store. And that kind of is a good, to me, it's an analogy too, of like, sometimes you have to like really look at, what are the positives? So I really looked at, the positives. And I do know, remember when we used to fight about online banking, right? That was seen as like, and now I'm like, oh my God, like I love that I can do all my online banking. So
Yeah. Like, I mean, just the way we conduct ourselves with commerce, right? If you use Apple Wallet or you don't, or you still write checks. I mean, I had some business matter recently where somebody said, "Could you please send your check here?" And I don't have checks. Right? And they were like, "What do you mean?" I said, "Like, you guys are still asking for checks, or you give me an email address, right, and they'll send you some money." Like this makes no sense to me. I was in England in the fall, and this particularly was something that they developed during COVID. But it was literally in many places, pubs and restaurants, and that it was impossible to pay cash.
mhm.
Like I had taken some cash with me for just figuring I might need it here and there. There was nothing. There was no place. Um, I spent £30, I think, in cash, and that was in the Portobello Road Market, where you got street vendors, and those guys like prefer cash anyway, right? So, but that was it. Everything else, like if you went into a pub, it was just you had to pay with the tap. There was no, and it was something that COVID entrenched, and then everybody just stayed with it. So, I mean, that's the sort of world we're going to. It's kind of like you may prefer to pay cash, right? But you're not going to be able to
Right.
in some places, right? You may prefer to read your news in print, but get your head around this. It's over,
It's over.
right? It's just a matter of time, right? It's ending. So figure out how to enjoy it digitally, right? How
Yeah.
to read it on your laptop then maybe instead, or put it on your laptop and print it out if that's, that's how, if you feel that strongly about it. But you just have to accept that that change happens, right? You don't have to like it,
Right.
but you have to accept it.
I think that is the biggest thing that, and again, back to the world I'm in. And I know, hi, Whitney. Whitney is in our audience today. So Whitney says hello. And she is also a fellow marketer in the manufacturing world. And one of the biggest roadblocks we're finding again, it comes down to change, right? And holding on to still doing cold calls and emails to get in touch with people. And I said, when you send an email, once it's off the screen, it's like it's forgotten, right? It's gone. So, when I've done work with clients, I always said, like, go to where your audience or your prospects are at. So if they're not on email, like if I send an email to my son, I'm not going to get any response. He doesn't, like, he'll check his email if he knows. And then I usually send a text, say, check your email for something. And I think this is what's missing too, is listening to the audience. So maybe can we talk about that in terms of, because I know this is a big issue in manufacturing, but in the world of legislation and our current government, do you think that some of these changes, are they listening to what the audience, which is the people that are out there using social media, that are getting their content, there seems to be a disconnect. So maybe you can talk about that as someone that did come out of.
Yeah, well, let's kind of start with this is lots of governments fall into this trap. This government has bought the whole thing, right? And you become captive of lobbyists who are explaining the world to you. And politicians are a lot of things, but they're typically experts at nothing other than being politicians. And you have to have sympathy for that, right? Like journalists are the same. I often found most journalists were the same. They knew this much about this many things, right? So it was really, you had some who would be experts, right, in that sort of stuff. So that's where you always had to ask questions, right? I used to say to journalists, the only stupid question you ask is the one you don't ask, right? Because you're pretending you know something that you don't. Be honest about what you don't know. And this is sort of the failure that government has fallen into, is it's talked to people whose interests were heavily vested in the old way of doing things, right? With the CRTC, where you lived within a regulated world of radio and television, right? And within that regulated world, because I spent 10 years there too, right? It's a lot of the discussions end up about defining the size of the economic pie, and then deciding, to make a long story short, who gets how big a slice, right? But every effort is made to make sure everybody gets a slice, right? It's almost like you can, if you lose, it's just not that you didn't get a slice in, a hearing and that sort of stuff, but the regulatory system becomes captive to all of those who are trying to profit from it, except for you and me, the television viewer and the radio listener, right? Somewhere in there, somebody who's serving us. And is the system serving us, or is it serving its adherents, the people who are regulated? So you can come up with something that, this is great. I'll give you an example. It's something called programming of national interest, right? Is a category. PNI, as people inside the system know it. And it's really about scripted drama and other sorts of things, right? So it prescribes you will show so much scripted drama. Whether people want to watch, maybe people just want to watch reality television. Yeah. Maybe they don't care about scripted drama anymore. Scripted drama will come and go, it'll come back. But ACTRA, the Actors Union, wants to make sure there's scripted drama, because scripted drama means jobs for ACTRA. It also means jobs for the Writers Guild. Now, don't get me wrong, these groups are perfectly entitled to advocate on their members' behalf. They should, but somewhere in there, somebody's got to say, hey, what if nobody wants to watch that anymore? You guys are just going to have to adapt. You're going to have to find jobs elsewhere and that sort of thing. So along comes YouTube and all kinds of entertainment platforms outside of that regulatory system, and people creating their content there are trying to do one thing, and that's to build and serve audiences. They're not trying to satisfy a regulator. They're not trying to argue for a piece of a pie. They're trying to fight for some, but it's wide open. They're trying to do this. And when that happens, then all of a sudden people within the system go running to the CRTC or the government and say, change is happening, make it stop. And the government says, okay, right? Because these guys come in and they say that they represent everybody in this group like this, and they don't. And I'm quite sure with the Online Streaming Act that the government, when it was drawing up the legislation, was completely unaware of the fact that there's 100,000 Canadians who make some sort of living out of creating YouTube content.
Mm-hmm. That is, thank you for that summary, because that's really important to look at, because it applies in so many areas of, I call it, it's easy to get into the echo chamber, tunnel vision, whatever you want to call it, that you only see, and also sometimes the loudest voices, or that saying, follow the money, the people with the biggest checkbooks, right, are getting attention, but that's not necessarily fulfilling the mandate of who your audience is and who you really should be appealing to.
Right. I mean, any of your, the manufacturers or anybody in business, I mean, you should be serving, the consumer, mm-hmm. right? And the problem with the governments and this regulatory approach is that you're serving, imagine, like, sort of for manufacturers, you end up creating a system that serves all the suppliers, right? And then just leaves the audience to choose what you decide you're going to give them, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of how the government's regulatory broadcasting system works. The government, through the CRTC, decides what you should be watching or what you should be buying, and it gives you a list to choose from, and pretends that it's giving you choice, right? But it's moderating the amount of choice you can have. Because anybody who's doing anything, they have to seek and find their audiences, right? And their audiences are online. Big controversy this past winter when the president of the CRTC suggested that, CBC suggested that 10 years from now, CBC might be out of broadcasting and would be, primarily a digital entity, right? And there was much, gnashing of teeth and pulling of hair and that sort of stuff, saying, how could that happen? And I'm looking at it and saying, well, are you nuts? Of course it's going to be all digital, because that's where your audience is. And if you're going to serve your audience, that's where you will find them, right? And that's why that's why Facebook and Google have 80% of the digital advertising market, because they're better at it than anybody else, right? They can find you your audience. They can, if you're looking for bald-headed men who play golf and and enjoy pickleball, they will find them for you, right? And you can advertise directly to them in ways that newspapers never could.
Well, it's definitely more targeted, and anybody that's worked in coming from where we've come from, and also seeing the potential for the future, will realize like digital is filled with many opportunities. And I'm an advocate for social media and using social media as a tool, but that doesn't mean, I often say this, it doesn't mean that that's the only tool in the toolbox. Like, it's one tool. You need to, I still meet with people in person. I still go to events, but I also do a tremendous amount of networking online. And that's where it's, even through COVID, when a lot of people were struggling, I was ready to dive in and, make connections. And it really was very telling to me of when people, even restaurants, that I said, well, you have to change the way you're doing business. Like you can't just say, throw your hands up. You need to look. There was one restaurant here locally. What they did was they changed a bit of their business model and promoted online family meals. So even though they were a higher end restaurant, but what happened was they would serve like family type meals. You go pick them up. But it also was helping to promote them for after COVID, right? So that when people could start going back to the restaurant, you might never have tried that restaurant. And they were able to really evolve.
Yeah, I mean, and how we communicate with each other. This is like a really interesting discussion, because ever since email was invented, right? And then texting, right? Texting was big in Europe long before it got big here. Now people just text constantly. Like I go to the gym and I'm waiting to get on one of the machines, and there's some kid sitting there and he's just sitting at the machine and he's texting to people. And I just kind of, I want to, anyway, all these things are different, but we're learning how to do this, and we're still learning and developing how our manners around it, right? I mean, for decades and centuries, we've developed, these systems of how we can get along with each other in a civilized manner. We say please, or we say thank you. We say you're welcome, and all kinds of protocols. Or do you refer to somebody as sir or madam, or is that appropriate? And, is Miss or Mrs. or Ms. All these things are always evolving, right? That we have to get used to, and the fundamentals of how we communicate through email and that sort of stuff are still evolving, right? You get a group email, there's the famous oops, I hit reply to all with that one, right? And panicky talking to how do I drink that one back, right? I just said something nasty about Peter in this group email, and oh my God, I'm going to get fired. And some people do, right? But all those things people are still learning about, or group chats and that sort of stuff. So we're still evolving our mannerisms, right? So like even Twitter, you block people. People are anonymous and they say horrible things to each other and that sort of stuff. You have to learn how to navigate your way through that. But people also have to understand that we're the sort of first generation doing this, maybe second, but sort of as a wave, and we're still learning how to manage this potentially wonderful tool that the internet is. And certainly when it started off, everybody was very optimistic about how it would work, and then now people are a little less optimistic because we've had all the fun part, and now some of the bad parts coming up.
Well, it is.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. I know you're having roofing work done, so we said we're live, so that's okay. It's that's email etiquette, texting etiquette, how to communicate, how to use these different tools, and it's why I've also transitioned now to do public relations, because I came from the world of my very first job in newspaper was covering junior B hockey when I knew nothing about it, but I learned quickly when I was in high school. and it was on a manual typewriter. So I've gone from a manual typewriter to now where I live with this thing, right? And one of the things that I think that as I look back on my life, the one big positive for me has been that I am willing to adapt, and I don't have to always like it. Thankfully, I've always found it fascinating to transition and see, okay, what does this mean? Even when I got on Twitter, and it's also about willing to take some risks and be wrong and make mistakes. And I will say this as now a recovering journalist. I said, being a journalist taught me a lot about being humble, because I was interviewing people that knew more than I did. One little sidebar story I want to share, because this goes to the next topic I'd like to talk about, is where do we get information from, and what are some tips on that? When I was a journalist, I remember going to an event and someone came up to me and they were arguing about something related to a story, and they said, you can't believe what you read. And I said, well, no, you shouldn't believe everything you read, because it's from one perspective of a reporter. And when I go out, I'm one set of eyes looking from one angle. So someone else standing at the other side of the room might have a different view. So I said, you should always question and be aware. And this person was so shocked that because I said, yeah, it's one perspective. And I think that's why I'm now, I decided to leave journalism for a lot of reasons, but that I still maintain my passion for, being curious, asking questions, and still telling and sharing stories, but just in a different venue. And a big part of what I do is also continue to get my information from different sources. Can you talk about that? And maybe we'll touch upon, I did want to talk about censorship, and I hope I don't get a strike from YouTube. So if I get a strike, we're talking about it, but because I am fascinated by what's happening and where we talked about this beforehand, I can tell if people only get it from one source or one mainstream source. So over to you to maybe.
Well, I think the real challenge, journalism has a couple of challenges right now, and one of them we've talked about, which is technological change, and the other one we haven't talked about yet, but which is trust and the diminishing levels of trust. Now, this is not exactly new, right? Like, there were surveys done in the 1980s and 1990s where people were hesitant to trust journalism. They could spot obvious bias at some points and that sort of thing. But the big challenge for journalists is to serve, again, audiences. And what audiences want is to know what's going on. And they don't want somebody to interpret that for them, unless it's in here's a column and we're going to do this for you. When they're reading the news, or you're listening to the news or watching the news, they want somebody to tell them what happened, who was involved, and what different people think about that, right? So it needs to be objective, or as objective as you can make it. And when you don't, you undermine trust. Because back in the days before the internet, you could undermine trust a little bit, but nobody could correct you online. Nobody could go there and say, oh yeah, well, you didn't talk to this guy, you didn't talk to that guy, and there's a hole in this story you could drive a truck through. Like why did you do this and why didn't you do that? And it's just got worse as newsrooms have got smaller. And, and a lot of experienced copy editors, for instance, were let go, right? The guys who would stop and say, wait a second, you need to talk to, you haven't talked to the industry on this, right? Mm-hmm. You've talked to the union, but you haven't talked to the boss. You've talked to the boss, but you haven't talked to the union, right? We need to make sure we have an effort to do this, and to use and to be aware of your biases. We all have them, right? And there's been this sort of argument of late from this coming out of journalism schools of all things that, well, nobody can be perfectly objective, right? So let's just stop trying, right? Which is crazy, right? That's like saying no surgeon can have a perfectly steady hand, so let's stop trying to have steady hands. It's still an aspiration, mm-hmm. and you need to be. To me, that's where you get curious about. Be curious about your own biases,
right?
Challenge yourself when you're pursuing something, right? To make sure, don't, when you choose the political scientist, and this is one you see journalists do all the time, when they want comment, they'll find a political scientist or an academic, otherwise academic, to comment on something, who, surprise, sees things exactly the way the journalist sees it, right? And what journalists should be doing is sitting there and thinking, okay, well, I know Fred will say this. I should phone Susan and ask her what she thinks, because she often disagrees with Fred, right? And then, and then you get the reader's well informed and begins to trust you, right? The American Press Institute has some interesting stuff on this, and I can't remember the fellow's name right now, but the phrase is something to the extent of assumptions or presumptions are the mother of all screw ups. That's when you go wrong, is when you presume something, right? You assume that, oh, Peter just said this. That's a terrible thing to say, right? So Peter's a terrible person, and we'll just go from that foundation, rather than phoning Peter and talking to Peter and saying, how could you say such a thing? And I could say, well, you have to understand that you've only got the second half of the sentence. The first half of the sentence was this, right? Or something like that. So, but if you presume and you just run with that, you get into all kinds of trouble. And that's where, no matter what we do, and we're using journalism as an example, but no matter what we're doing, if you to just repeat that phrase, assumption is the mother of all screw-ups.
I do like that. And the other thing that is a real sits in my craw is cherry picking of comments that get posted, and people comment and they just take it out of context. And one thing why over my years as a journalist, to this day, there's people that I still kept in touch with. And one of the things they said they appreciate about me is that there was sometimes I know I could have written the story in a way that would have, they said it, I know what context they gave, but I could have written the story in a bit different way, and it would have either shamed them or wasn't exactly what they meant. And I was always very aware of, making sure the context was right. And I see this so often in social media now, where people take a clip from something, and I'm someone that will go listen to the long form interviews, because I'm going to go find out this is on all political sides too, right? Where someone takes something and it gets, it's just not an accurate depiction. I see it a lot, definitely in the States. I've been following, just being curious what's happening with the Robert Kennedy Jr. campaign. Mm-hmm. And wow, like the level, talking about censorship, I've been shocked at, I just was talking to someone, they said, well, isn't he a bit of a kook? I said, okay, go listen to a 3-hour interview with him and listen to context, and then we'll have another discussion. I said, after you go listen to that, and it's the same. It's not about agreeing or disagreeing with everything. It's more about understanding the context of where people come from. And so that's
because you're interested in the truth, right? And you only discover that or get close to it the more questions you ask, and the more curious you become, and that sort of stuff, and take the time to look into that, as opposed to doing this is the classic sort of Twitter response. And a lot of journalists fall into this, this sort of gotcha stuff, right? Where they bug you until you say something stupid or the wrong way. And I've seen this happen and had it taped, right? You can hear all the tape recorders go off at the same time.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, we got him, right? We finally got him, right? Or her, whatever, when you do that. And that's terrible, right? Because you're working to get the person out of context and controversial. Or the Twitter, the Twitter challenge. If I said, if you tweeted something and I said, Gail, I think that's a stupid comment, right? And that was kind of blunt like that. And then somebody comes back and says, so Menzies thinks all women are stupid. Is that what you're saying, Peter? Are you saying all women are stupid? And all of a sudden you're trending with hashtag misogynist, right? In a way you go. Yeah. And that's what, again, because in the Twitterverse and the places like that, people are actively looking to take people down.
Yes.
Right? So they will, and they're, some of them are paid to do it. And that's why most people are sane enough not to be on Twitter very much.
Well, I'm on Twitter a lot, and I will see, this is where I will say we might have a different view on that, is that what I like about Twitter is that when you curate your feed and you use the scroll button, there's some people I'm like, I always said, I heard this saying once, just because someone invites you to an argument doesn't mean you have to attend or, RSVP yes. And to me, Twitter is a big source of my news content because I want to get the kind of more broader picture of things. But there's some people, like the content I'm getting is, it's how I found you to a certain extent. Melissa Mabarkey is an amazing person that's very rational, reasonable about her perspective on, from an Indigenous perspective as well as energy. Norm Spector, he can be a little abrupt with people sometimes, but only because he doesn't suffer fools.
Just because he's a grumpy old man.
But I love his take on it. And I don't agree with everything with him, and that's the thing. I like listening to people too that I don't agree with. It's sort of I want to hear different views, and there's just so much missing when we dismiss people that we don't agree with and call them stupid or call them names, as opposed to saying, okay, I may not like this policy or perspective, but let me figure out what else, why is that? Why do you think
I think what people need to do, and I try to do this, is I try to manage my algorithms, the algorithms that are serving me, right? So I make sure I don't just go to news sources that I generally find agreeable, which is a habit most of us do. Most of us like to hang out with people we find agreeable. Mm-hmm. We don't like to hang out with people who challenge us when we say something, right? So if we say, I think Peter's stupid, you want 4 or 5 other people going, yeah, the dude is seriously stupid, right? You don't want somebody saying, no, I think he's smart, right? So you avoid conflict and that sort of stuff. But then you end up living in this self-reinforcing world. So, if you're gonna go to the National Post site, make sure you go to the Toronto Star site, right? Because they both have very definite perspectives, ideological and political perspectives, right? But then you'll get a balance in your feed, right? You'll see things, and that used to be one of the wonderful things about newspapers that we would work with, was on the op-ed pages. At least the one I ran, you tried to make sure there were, I was a big believer that everything reads better in contrast. Right? So if Gail's writing her view of the world on this issue, there's Peter writing his view of the world on this issue. I can read them both and decide which one makes the most sense, or say, well, I agree with that Gail said, but I think kind of agreed with Peter on that point too, right? And you become a bit more informed citizen. When you go to these self-reinforcing places, it gets worse. And what's even worse, and this is something that wanted to talk about too, is rather than do that and challenge your own presumptions again, right, or your own preset opinions or worldviews, people now just try to shut the other side down. They just sort of say, well, that needs to be censored. That's outrageous. Nobody, how can you say that? How can you argue against this? You feel that passionately about it, and your response is to turn yourself into some sort of fascist and decide that you're going to deny that person the right to their freedom of expression. It's very troubling.
That, that I would like to do. I want to do a whole other show on that. That might have to be on Twitter, because to talk about censorship. And one person that I've listened to, because I did think he was, I thought he was kind of a knuckle dragger, was Joe Rogan. All of what I heard about him, he was this horrible person. Then I went and listened to his podcast, and I was fascinated. He has he interviews some amazing people, diverse people. So again, that's what I tell you, because while I'm doing other things, I listen to this. And, it's almost, if you say that, people go, oh, well, you must be a right winger or whatever. And I'm like, he's a good interview that has really, I was just listening to, he interviewed someone about the rainforest. Wasn't political. It was just a really in-depth, intriguing piece. And I'm really taken aback at how people want to shut down people with different views. We've lost, that's definitely a cultural shift that people, and I think to me, it really did start really through the whole COVID. Like that was where, families started saying, if you agree with this, if you don't agree with this, get off my Facebook page, or you can't come to Christmas dinner, or if you don't, I'm taken aback.
Yeah, I don't think we represented ourselves very well as human beings. When you go through that, I think it's like sometimes at crisis moments in life and that sort of stuff, it asks big questions of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
The answers aren't always the ones we want, right?
Yes.
What we find out about ourselves individually and as groups, and in terms of that. So there is this sort of, and sometimes it's in the name of tolerance, but this growing intolerance. And what's really missing, and politicians of all stripes are doing this too, is they grab this. It's sort of like the Twitter conversation I was saying. So you just said this, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're sowing seeds of division. This is more, and people throw the word hate around all the time, right? When was the last time you heard a politician say, when there's a sort of big debate going on, sort of, look, people, calm down, listen to each other, right? Stop and listen, right? You might learn something. You speak to each other respectfully, right? I mean, I feel like I'm so old that I actually remember people doing that, right? And once you're in a leader position, stop being partisan.
Yeah.
If you're the Premier of Saskatchewan or Manitoba or Ontario or the Prime Minister of the country, you are Prime Minister for everybody, right? Yeah. You can save that other stuff for your election campaigns, but your job is to unify us all, right?
Yeah.
Or, premiers, I mean, not just picking on the one guy there, but all of this has been happening for some time. We need leaders who will take us together as a group to someplace. Some of us will have to go kicking and screaming. I get that. But, Ralph Klein's old phrase was find out where the crowd is going, or find out where the parade is headed and get out in front of it, right? Sort of thing, so that you're actually listening to people and leading them, right? Not doing this, not making things worse. And I really wish people would, get away from that response that, just name calling. It's childish, right? We need to be able to talk to each other as grown-ups.
Yes, that is. There's so much more we could say on that, and I want that is such a key point for us all to mull over. So I know we need to wrap up. Although we could continue on, Peter. There's so many other. I had of course, as usual, I have many, many more questions, which was when I was a reporter, I used to always have way more questions for every interview. So how do you exercise your curious mind, Mr. Peter Menzies?
Oh, my curious mind. How do I exercise that? I guess in the same way by, just asking questions, right? Asking, why a lot, just like a little kid does, the 5-year-old kid who's sort of like, why is the sky blue? Why is the sun yellow? Why is the earth, the dirt brown or black or that sort of stuff, is to ask those questions. And I think the big thing for us to do, and I think one of the things, personally, I think I was well suited to journalism, and I think I was reasonably well suited to the regulatory role that I played, in that I like to ask questions. I like to find out why, and I have a pretty good BS detector, right? And it's sort of like, okay, that just doesn't quite make sense to me. Are you trying to do this or do that? Because I'm trying to get through the spin. I find it very tiresome when I see people just repeating statements, right? Like somebody issues a press release, right, that says Peter is 100 years old, right? And somebody writes it down without ever checking, right? Or without they just assume that they're being told the truth, and then they're being told a lie, and they just repeat it. And that's the sort of tension I enjoyed in newsrooms, where somebody would say, well, I got this story about something Gail just said. And they'd say, well, is it true? They go, well, she said it. And I'm like, okay, that's not enough, right? Find out whether she was lying to you or not, right? And because if it's true, it's a really good story.
And what is the reason why Gail might have said that? Like, that's the other thing. I don't think this is what I find is missing a lot of times. We don't dig into, like, why is this being pushed or promoted? And because there's usually always a reason. I mean, there's a reason for everything everybody does, right? So
yeah, and you have to do that without becoming too cynical.
Yes.
We call it corrosive cynicism, because it turns out it could be that Gail just wants to make the world a better place.
I am a bit Pollyanna about that. I do believe that I have a lot of hope. And again, the reason for this show was when I was in journalism school, we had shirts that were made out to change the world on deadline. I took that to heart. I'm still believing that there's a way to change the world, and it's by being more curious. So I want to thank you, Peter, for your time today, your excellent perspective, your insights. It was so enjoyable, and I look forward to our paths continuing to cross over on Twitter as well, and on LinkedIn.
Yeah, thanks very much. I enjoyed your curiosity. It was an engaging conversation. I look forward to our next encounter.
Okay, well, I'm sure there might be a follow-up, and maybe we'll have another discussion about the other C word that we were talking about too, that censorship, because that's fascinating to me. So. Okay, we'll see you later. And I was going to say I'll see you in the green room, but I know you've got to dart out, so I'll just say goodbye while I do my wrap up.
Okay, thanks, Gail.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Wow, what a very pleasurable discussion just had with Peter Menzies. And, while this is a show about the media, it also does apply to so much in manufacturing and industry and business overall, because it's so valuable when we can ask more questions, when we can be more curious, and when we can look at things like, who is our audience and why is it important to get information and get the whole story, get the full perspective. And like we were talking about near the end of the show, where Peter was saying, sometimes we need to step back and, we can disagree without being disagreeable. And when it comes to my manufacturing world and when I'm consulting with clients, the other thing is it's also so important to get out of that echo chamber and get out of the belief that, social media is bad, or that our only way to recruit or to develop sales is by, the way it used to be done. Because there is a world wide web. There's an opportunity out there. And that's something Peter, I know, has talked about. If you follow him and read some of the other work he's done and listen to some of his other podcasts, he talks about how we need a more visionary approach. And I would say the same holds true in the world of manufacturing and public relations. How can you be visionary? How can you look at embracing social media as a tool, and a tool that can bring you much great opportunity? So thanks, everyone. I appreciate all of the listeners here today, and people will be listening on replay as well. And enjoy.